Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming on a warm and stuffy Monday evening. But it's great to see you all here. I'm Ben Brucey. I'm an editor at Penguin Random House. I'm actually Benjamin's editor, so I'm completely biased about this book. I haven't got any objectivity, but I'm very happy that you've all come today, and I'm delighted that Benjamin and Rachel Joyce have joined us. The next 40 minutes, in a way, is sort of a language masterclass. You've got two very smart and kind language experts. They're not grammar police. For the next 40 minutes, they're going to be sharing things they've learnt. They're going to be talking the big questions in writing. They're going to be talking about the fun questions as well. But they are both extraordinary writers in their own right. Benjamin is an extraordinary editor too, and speaking as an editor, I guess to do a football analogy, he is the Premier League of editors, and I'm probably the Vauxhall Conference of editors. Working with him has been quite an experience, but a privilege too. And as you'll learn in a moment, Benjamin and Rachel have worked together, both as editor and author. And also as friends. So I think we're going to have a lovely conversation. And I first just wanted to sort of give them both a formal introduction because they are extraordinary writers, like I said, in their own right. Rachel Joyce has come here from France yesterday. Yesterday morning she was staring up at a mountain in fresh clean air, and now she's in London. So we're very grateful she's made the journey here. But Rachel is the author of numerous Sunday Times and international bestsellers, including The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, Perfect, The Love Song of Miss Queenie Hennessy, The Music Shop, and a collection of interlinked short stories, A Snow Garden and Other Stories. Her work has been translated into 36 languages. I might be incorrect there, but that's
I think that sounds about right. I don't really know.
And her books have had numerous awards. The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Book Prize, longlisted for the Man Booker Prize. Rachel was awarded the Specsavers National Book Awards New Writer of the Year, and she's also been shortlisted for the UK Author of the Year. She's also written over 20 original radio plays and adaptations of classics for Radio 4, including the Bronte novels. And she moved to writing after a long career as an actor, performing lead roles for the RSC, the National Theatre, and Cheek by Jowl. Incredibly impressive. We should give a round of applause. That is
Just downhill from here.
And Benjamin. So Benjamin has travelled all the way from New York to be with us here today. But Benjamin, again, has had a long and very interesting career. So Benjamin does work in publishing as well as being a writer. So he's the Vice President, Executive Managing Editor and Copy Chief of Random House, which is America's most prestigious publishing list. He began his publishing career as a freelance proofreader and copy editor, and he's overseen books by writers including Michael Chabon, the late great Edmund Morris, Suzan-Lori Parks, Michael Pollan, Peter Straub, and Calvin Trillin. He's copy-edited numerous authors, including Rachel Joyce, E.L. Doctorow, David Ebershoff, Frank Rich, and Elizabeth Stroud, as well as Let Me Tell You, a volume of previously uncollected work by Shirley Jackson, who I know is a personal favourite of yours. So the book we're here to talk about today, Dry as English, was first published in the United States earlier this year, where it instantly became a New York Times bestseller, received critical acclaim, and readers have just been sort of picking up and buying it like hotcakes, really. And I'm proud to say that the UK edition of the book was published last Thursday, and we've had fantastic coverage in the Sunday Times and the Guardian, and this is the first event for the book. So tonight, I think Benjamin and Rachel hope you have a lot of fun. So the first thing to sort of kick things off, Benjamin, if you don't mind, would you sort of explain to us all what copy editing actually is? Because for people outside of the world of book publishing, it might not be an obvious career profession, and I'd love you to sort of explain how it works when an author writes a book. What happens?
Once the author has written the book, and once the author has gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth with the person that I always refer to as the editor to distinguish that job from the thing that I do. So they've gone back and forth through this book, and they have finally decided that it is the way that it is supposed to be. They've worked out all of the major issues of pacing and characterization and likability when that's an issue, and all of those really sort of big creative hurdles that need to be properly conquered to make a book the way it's supposed to be. So then it's handed off to be, it's handed off to be a lot of things, but it's handed off, among other things, to be copy edited. And copy editing is not so much that sort of big ticket, long arc kind of work, though of course the copy editor is trying to keep their eyes open for plot points, inconsistencies, the sort of things that just sort of get past people. But you're starting really at the very mechanical level of making sure that everything is spelled correctly. You're working on the punctuation, you're regularizing it, you're improving it, you're making suggestions that you think are improving it, and then you'll see what your author has to say about that when the author is reviewing the copy editing. So it's that very sort of nuts and bolts stuff that is very important, the sort of things that you want to get right. But there are the additional things that a copy editor can bring to the task that include very logistical things, the real life facts that get worked into even fiction. I wish that I could off the top of my head think of a very good London example, but I can't. But for instance, in Manhattan, the avenues run north or they run south, and the streets they run east and they run west, and sometimes authors get them mixed up, and so your job as the copy editor is to straighten that out. But you're also doing things like all authors have pet words. There's a color that they'll latch on, and suddenly every dress, every tablecloth, every wall, and it's not thematic, it's just, she likes purple a lot. So the third time it comes up is when you start saying, it's purple again. And you're calling the author's attention to things like that. Authors have pet words, they have pet turns of phrase. I didn't find out, for instance, once the shoe was thoroughly on the other foot and I was being copy edited, I didn't realize that I was exceptionally fond of the phrase garden variety. Garden variety this, garden variety that, 6 times over the course of 75,000 words, which is 5 times too many. So copy editors are very good about that sort of thing. They're looking for inadvertent rhymes, they're looking for inadvertent puns, because writers' brains do that. They make little jokes. They didn't mean to, but they end up on the page. And if they're intentional, great. When they're not is when you want to sort of finesse that and clean that up. Anyway, so that's this whole process, this sort of nuclear level, sentence by sentence, comma by comma, semicolon by semicolon, working on the manuscript. And then, when you're done, you send it off, and it goes off to the author, who then gets to go through it and decide what of your brilliant suggestions the author likes, and which ones the response is, you know what? I like it the way I wrote it in the first place. And when it goes really well, and it should go really well, and copy editors are very, they try to be very sympathetic, empathic people. You really try when you're a copy editor to get into the head of the author so that you are supplying suggestions that are, as I like to say, the sort of thing the writer would have come up with if the writer had spent, another few minutes with each sentence in the book and hadn't already read each sentence in the book 500 times. So you're trying to be the editor's sort of the author's deputy, alter ego, and when it works, it works.
It does.
Okay.
It does.
So Rachel,
Yeah.
could you briefly describe working with Benjamin on
Yeah,
your
I
first
mean,
book?
it's
Yeah.
because when I first wrote a novel, I'd worked in radio, so I'd worked where you work on the script and then you work with the producer or the editor, and sort of some things have to go. Maybe there's a type problem with the length, but nothing as specific as working with a copy editor. So I'd written the book of Harold Fry, and then I worked with the editor, and I now think I mean, this isn't, I'm not trying to, I hope I'm not going to offend any editors, but kind of, the editor is like the brilliant midwife who comes in and gets the thing out. And, you know, and sends the cards to everybody and says, hey, listen, this has been born, you know, and kind of whips up the storm. But when somebody like Benjamin walks in, I don't know how many people have given birth here, but it's like when the best surgeon, doctor, walks in the room and lifts up your baby and says, right, I'm going to count every single toe, every single little muscle. I'm just going to make sure that this whole thing works. And that's what it feels like when you work with a really good copy editor. It's somebody who just gets what you're trying to say, but can, you know, sometimes you want to say things very simply, but you end up saying them in a kind of slightly complicated way. And a brilliant copy editor can just take away some of that padding and kind of give it back to you, and you think, yeah, it shines now. But it's a real gift, I think, what you do. A real gift. And it's also without ego, which I think is a, you know, is another great gift.
Yeah, I mean, you really are, you are working entirely in the service of your author. You learn, and maybe it took me a few years working as a copy editor to learn this. You are not in the manuscript to turn the manuscript into what you think good writing is.
No.
You're there in the manuscript to enhance the writing that is on the page. And when you're lucky, it's already good or better or great.
Yeah.
But no copy editor can ever turn a not good manuscript into a great book. You can't, and I've tried. back in the old days when all I was doing was copy editing. Every now and then you'd get an assignment from an editor, and he would say, just do what you can. And it was like, yeah, and you get in there and you roll your sleeves up and you labor and you rewrite much more than you ought to, and you find that when you're finished, it's really not any better than it was when you started, and you've put all of that energy into it, and
Yeah.
and it wasn't really very much fun. But the first time that I got to work with Rachel, I was not the copy editor on Harold Fry,
No.
but I did find myself, by my own request, as the copy editor of Rachel's novel Perfect, which is one of the favorite things I've ever worked on, because it's such a beautiful and I know this is a sort of a dull word, and if I were copy editing myself, I would come up with a better word. It's such a profound book, and it's a thoughtful book, and it's a sad book, but it's so beautifully written, and it was such a pleasure to just sort of get in there and sentence by sentence just do a little,
Yeah.
a little of that, a little of that, a little of that, and it worked, and I think we had a
did.
really good time.
We were I was actually this morning, I tried to go back through emails to find the original draft that we were exchanging, and it was things like I'd written Byron, the little boy, suddenly looks up and says, "The sun's coming up," Byron said brightly. And quite rightly, Benjamin said to me, "Do you really need brightly with the sun coming up?" And it was just, you know, you didn't need that. In fact, one of the things I loved when I first opened your book, and I'm trying to write one at the moment, was your list of words to get out of your book. And I instantly went to my manuscript and I just started cutting out, because it's things like, I mean, you should read out the list
You should read out the list, Benjamin. It's on
of
the back
things
the
to
book
take
here.
away.
Oh, that's just convenient on the back of the book.
Read out the heading as well.
Yes, go a week. The life-changing magic of tidying up your prose. Go a week without writing very, rather, really, quite, in fact. The one that didn't make it to the back cover, it's my absolute arch enemy, because it's the one I'm so horribly aware of how often I say it. Actually, actually, and and you should do your best to dispose of them, because they're not really doing anything. They're not really doing.
They're
anything
not,
for
and
you.
I can put in a bit, or, you know, she was feeling quite something or other, and it's though, you know, like when you take out those words, you create a much more strident, and you're not apologising for your prose anymore. It's so things like that I found really helpful, and they just sort of unpick those habits that we might have, or those apologies that we might have, or those hang-ups that we have about our writing.
I mean, I think that when writers reach for the word very, which they do constantly, you're trying to make that point. You're trying to drive that point home. But what happens, I think, on the page and in the reader's brain is you're pleading. It's like you could say that somebody is smart. You could say that somebody is beautiful. You can say that somebody is hungry, and then you keep attaching the very to it. It's like no, she's really smart, really, and it's like adjectives stand so much stronger when they're standing on their own, and you're not pushing, you're not making your argument really hard. You're just saying what you have to say.
Yeah. And it's sort of then as if the story is allowed to be told. The reader and the story are allowed to come together without the writer sort of, doing some frilly bits.
Yeah. And not always. I mean, there's a wonderful novelist of my acquaintance who every time I drag out the get rid of the varies thing, she online she does that, and she's they're two very good syllables and they're not offending anybody, and every now and then you just want this incredibly utilitarian simple little emphasizer and shut up, Benjamin.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I will talk out of as many sides of my mouth as is necessary to say, yes, you should do this, but you could do that. Because there are no absolutes.
No.
And there's no such thing as there's no objective anything. The writing is subjective, the copy editing is subjective.
Yes, although then there's also the lovely bit where you come to, like we had a bit with Perfect, where we had a whole long email kind of exchange about 70s biscuits.
Oh, yeah.
Brands of biscuiting, and nobody was as interested as Benjamin was, and I was, about brand biscuits they might, because I had about 6 biscuits to play with. But we had fun with that.
Oh, we had great fun with that. And then, of course, there was the day that I encountered the conversation between Diana and her antagonist.
Beverly.
Beverly.
Yes.
What a perfect name.
Yes.
Beverly. And the exchange was one of them saying, "You're awful." And the other one says,
I can't remember.
"But I like you." No, what is it?
Oh, you're awful, but I like you. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it didn't really read.
I recognized that I was reading something that had a meaning that was eluding me entirely. So I had to look it up. And then I learned all about Dick Emery.
Yes.
And the thing is, and we'll get to the subject of transatlantic translation and the complexities of that, because that was also part of what I was doing.
Yeah.
What I was doing for Perfect was, how do we preserve that exchange and give it just enough background that the reader isn't necessarily going to know the entire history of the Dick Emery story, but is going to recognize that it's a television catchphrase that they're exchanging back and forth. And how do you slide that into the text and give it some meaning? Because, I mean, what I was really trying to do was not suggest, can we just cut this?
No.
You know, it was like, if there's a way, is there going to be a way to save this and make it work for people who otherwise wouldn't get it at all?
Yeah.
And I think we found an okay way to do that.
I do, but I don't remember what
I don't
we
remember
did.
what it's like.
We'll have to go and find the book.
Like on the telly, I think one of them said. It's like, oh, okay, good. Like on the telly. That works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exclamation point. You're quite against people using exclamation points because well,
I mean, they're very good in novels for shouting and saying things that are particularly exciting, and for any sentence that's going to begin and it's like, well, then it needs to get to an exclamation point, otherwise it's just sort of dead and flat on the page. But writers will just stuff them into their manuscripts over and over again, and they're bossy, and they come under the heading of telling the reader how to read something, when you, as the writer, should be doing the work with the words. I mean, the thing that you say to toddlers when they start, making a lot of noise and carrying on, and you say, okay, use your words. It's like, pick the right words. Pick the right words that are going to convey what you're trying to do. Italics. I have a thing about italics. Writers who are endlessly filling their dialogue with italics because they want to tell you where the emphases are in the sentences. And I think that, well, if you chose the words nicely and you put them in the correct order, you won't need the italics. The words will the words will do their job all by themselves. I learned that lesson really well, and I've never needed to learn it again. When I was copy editing a novel by Elizabeth Stroud called The Burgess Boys, that was the first time it was the first book I worked on with her, and maybe a dozen times over the course of the book, I suggested, just one word in that sentence. Can we use a little italic? Can we use a little italic? And she said no each and every time, because she was confident that her dialogue was doing what it needed to do without any assistance from me or from italics. And she was right. So learn a lesson.
Wonderful. Well, let's go to the transatlantic differences again, because it's very interesting. So, Rachel, you had written the book in British English. It had been edited over here, and then part of Benjamin's job was to make it fully comprehensible to an American audience. And how did you find that process, Rachel? Was it strange?
Well, no, it was. I know with Harold Fry there were some that really threw. It wasn't Benjamin, but rubber gloves caused a stir. And a tease made, I just didn't know where to begin to explain what a tease made was. But then it's things like a vest. I just referred to a character in a vest, and then you said to me, a vest is three?
Waistcoat or vest?
Yeah. Yeah.
As I don't have to know how to pronounce them. I just have to know how to spell them.
Yeah. So sometimes it's just, it's just things that have gone in translation. But just going back, because there's also things that you do, well, like sometimes when you write, you assume that everybody knows, just because it's in your head, that there are 5 people in the car, for instance. And then I remember one day you just said, hang on a minute, where did Lucy get in the car? And I just assumed everybody, I knew Lucy was in the car, so I assumed everybody else would know. Things like that, just so clear. And that's not British, that was just me being, needing some help, really.
I mean, the thing is about, and some people get their backs up about this, so then I get my back up and turn about it, the translation of prose from one side of the ocean to the other. And what we do as a rule over in Random House in New York, if we are publishing a book that is either simultaneously being published in the United Kingdom or any place that speaks English that is not America, or following on, is we do certain things. Well, we have this absolutely ingenious piece of software that does all of the heavy lifting of changing the spellings, taking all the U's out of color and neighbor, tucking the periods inside the quotation marks instead of leaving them on the outside, turning the single quotes into double quotes, doing it the other way around, somehow being able to tell the difference between a single quote and an apostrophe, because it's been programmed to tell the difference. So all of that sort of mechanical work. Now, the point is simply to make the reading experience comfortable for the reader who's going to be reading the book. Not to make it stupid, not to dumb it down, just to make it that much more accessible, so the reader is not constantly being pulled out of the experience by the peculiarity of what's on the page. Now, beyond that sort of thing, the stuff that copy editors actually do, it's like my standard for translating British manuscripts into English is leave absolutely everything alone that is reasonably well known to a reasonably intelligent, reasonably Anglophilic reader. It's like, so we're not changing boots to trunks and lifts to elevators, because why should you do that? I mean, everybody knows what that sort of thing is. But only the stuff that's puzzling, or that like an odd reference to a Dick Emery catch line that just needs a little sort of help. And again, it's an entirely subjective thing. I mean, it's like, I know what a biscuit is, you know what a biscuit is, I don't have to call it a cookie.
No.
But there was one scene where somebody ends up getting squash spilled all over him.
Oh, squash, yeah. Squash was a problem.
And it was like, Americans just don't know what, I mean, squash is a zucchini, which means it's don't tell me, it's a courgette. Did I get that right? Good. But squash is not a drink. And so then, of course, I was spending a lot of time looking up what squash precisely is, and it's complicated because we don't have that sort of thing that you mix with other things to make something that you're going to drink. And I don't remember, I think we probably just sort of ultimately, some sort of fruit drink, fruit juice was just fine. And so basically what you're trying to do is find something that is faithful and coherent and works for everybody, not translating things ridiculously into terms that none of the characters would say, but just something that works on both sides. But every now and then just sort of talk about the peculiar subjectivity of it, was the reference to somebody driving and a reference to the sat-nav. And I had no idea what that was. And I looked it up. And I think GPS is a valid term here, but I liked it so much. Once I looked it up, when I found out what it was, I thought, okay, reader, let it be a challenge to you. So I left it in place because I wanted to. So it was fun. So it was the sort of copy editing enhancement that I tried to do with that extra game of trying to make the book, work.
Yeah.
So I guess the book, it isn't just aimed at writers, although if you are a writer of any kind, it will be very useful for you. But I think it can be aimed at all of us, really, whether we write emails, whether we write blogs, whether we write text messages, those sorts of things. And I think what's great about the book is it's very democratic. Benjamin presents lots of rules, and then he says, but there's always an exception to the rule. But there are some things you're quite passionate about. And one interesting, I guess it speaks punctuation, but the series comma, or the Oxford comma. Could you talk about the Oxford comma? And I thought perhaps maybe you could perhaps read an example that you give of why perhaps we should use a series comma sometimes.
So my thing about the series comma or the Oxford comma or the serial comma or whatever it is that you want to call it is that it is vital and it is useful and no sentence has ever been harmed by a series comma, and many sentences have been salvaged with series commas, and it's this sort of ongoing, absolutely ridiculous battle that goes on between the adherents to the series comma and the people who decry it, which in the United States tends to be book people versus journalists. Journalists are trained not to use it, they don't use it. So they think we're dreadful and I think they're silly, so we get to do that back and forth for the rest of our lives. Many journalist types I've observed abhor the series comma because they've been trained to abhor it and find its use as maddening as its champions find its non-use infuriating. Many of you Brits, apparently some people don't take kindly to that. Who knew? Not me. Many of you Brits, including even Oxford Brits, also avoid it. For whatever it's worth to you, everyone I've ever encountered in US book publishing uses it. One thing though, commas can't do everything, not even series comma. There's a sentence reputed to have shown up in the Times, your Times, often schlepped out in defense of the series comma, and though I'm weary of seeing it, I schlep it out myself to point out its weakness as a series comma defense. So here it is, hopefully for the last time in all our lives, though I doubt it. Highlights of his global tour include encounters with Nelson Mandela, an 800-year-old demigod, and a dildo collector. The sentence as published had a comma after Nelson Mandela, and it didn't have any comma following that. Now, the thing about that, as I say right here on the page, oh la la, one is intended to merrily note, is Nelson Mandela really an 800-year-old demigod and a dildo collector? Oh la la, I note, even if one sets a series comma, as in, highlights of his global tour include encounters with Nelson Mandela, comma, an 800-year-old demigod, comma, and a dildo collector, Mandela can still be read as an 800-year-old demigod. Some sentences don't need to be repunctuated, they need to be rewritten. And then the rewritten version finally is, highlights of his global tour include encounters with a dildo collector, comma, an 800-year-old demigod, comma, and Nelson Mandela. Was that so hard?
I wanted to touch, briefly on what you were both talking about at the beginning, which I think is very interesting, the subtitle of the book is an utterly correct guide to clarity and style, and I think as writers and readers, we all, that's what we aspire for. In a novel, an idea or an emotion that's communicated in a very clear and easy way that hits the reader straight away. Are there perhaps writers that you both admire that you might be able to talk about who you think have a great style or are very clear in the use of their language? Perhaps, Benjamin, authors you've worked with? Or?
Well, we both admire Elizabeth Stroud. I mean, really. I think she's an extraordinary writer. And I think she's got more and more extraordinary. I mean, I can't work out how she's put together My Name is Lucy Barton. I just can't. It's as if she had this. Sometimes people write a book and it's as if it was here and they just picked it up and threw it and everything landed. I mean, it's magical when people do that. But I think it's incredibly hard.
It is, and the writing is absolutely, it's unfancy, it's unfussy. It just does what it's doing. One thing that I have noticed about her writing as years has gone by, it's become, to my ear, it's become more musical.
Yes.
It just sort of sings and it wanders and it curves, and it just does it with this astonishing clarity.
Yeah.
Though, and I mean, I admire her writing for that quality. You're a very clear writer. Everything just it gets where it needs to go, and it goes there. Muriel Spark, who I'm starting to reread now in preparation for. God help me! I'm going to write another book, and I'm writing a book about fiction and how it works. So I'm going to be writing about all these writers that I really admire. And so I've got a whole long list of people I need to sort of reinvestigate. So anyway, I'm reading Spark, and it's like it's like they're never long, and she gets so much done. It's the same thing. I mean, it's funny. It's the same thing. I've noticed it in her. Mm-hmm. I notice it in Liz Stroud, and I notice it in your work as well. The books are not long, and you wonder how so much got done in relatively few pages. And I've never cracked that. I've never quite figured that out.
No, well, I can only speak personally. I find you write way more than you need, because it's almost as if the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth drafts are your journey into the story, and then finally you know it so well, and you're so confident that you know it well, which I think is the key. I think readers can smell a writer who's unsure, and it is to do with being brave enough to know we don't need that, because the reader is intelligent and they can make those jumps, or we'll just guess a little bit, or we don't need to say absolutely everything, because the right detail will say it. Penelope Fitzgerald, I think, is just brilliant. I mean, she's extraordinary at that, so deft, and yet I mean, she only needs perhaps one detail, and you've got it.
And I mean, I just want to say, it's like I don't value simplicity above all else. I mean, Lord knows I read my own writing, and it's like, and I love my curly cues and my digressions and my footnotes. It's the way my brain works translated into the way I write, and it took me a long time to figure out how to do that I wanted to do it, and how to be comfortable with it. And of course, everything needs to be reined in every now and then, especially me. But you write the way you write, and I think figuring that out is the hardest thing that any writer can do.
So when you began writing your book, was the voice of because the voice is so distinct, I mean, it's really smart, but it's not, it's not kind of, it's witty. So you can tell that you're having fun. And that's sort of infectious. But did you have that from the beginning?
No, and I wasn't having fun writing it, so there was nothing fun to be read. And I wrote tens of thousands of words and threw them out. Because what I realized I was doing was I thought that my mission was to take everything that was in every style guide that I had ever read and to digest it, and then, you'll pardon me, vomit it back onto the page, theoretically in my own words. Well, that wasn't what my job was. Also, it was painfully boring. And then finally I realized a few things, one of which was I can't be exhaustive. I don't want the book to be 600 pages long. So why don't you just write about the things that you find interesting? It's like, okay, well, that was a good thing. Then the issue of how to write about them. Basically, I realized that I'd been hanging around in all the time that I was supposed to be writing and I wasn't writing. So what was I doing? I was hanging out on Twitter. But I realized that tweeting noise I was making, that it was like anything for a joke, because if I make a joke, then people will pay attention to what I'm saying. And it's like, if I can make a serious point and get you to laugh about it, you'll remember it maybe a little bit better. And finally, I had that aha, eureka moment where it's like, oh, that's your writing style. That's your voice. Take your Twitter voice and translate it into prose and give yourself some room to work in. But then I had fun.
Yeah.
And then I was having fun, and then, in theory, so does the person who's then reading what I was doing when I was having fun.
One question I had reading the book, do you keep all of this knowledge in your head, or do you have to refer to guides?
I have a guide that I keep on my desk. It was the first big style manual that I had. It was the Random House style manual. There's a style manual in the United States called the Chicago Manual of Style. Extremely popular, very big business. Happens to be an ongoing institution, but there was this book that we had called Words into Type, which went out of print years ago. And I keep saying to people, "Oh, you can always find copies of it online. You can find copies of it online." I think apparently I've said it one too many times, because online is running out of copies, and the copies that are left are now getting really expensive. But it's this wonderful book, and I keep a copy of it on my desk. And there are things that I can't quite remember. And when I can't quite remember something, I always reach for that book. So no, there's always going to be things that I can't remember. And one of the things about that is it freed me up, and I say this up in front, there are going to be things where the things that I can't remember without looking them up, I may excuse myself from attempting to explain them to you. Because we all need to look things up every now and then. And there's no one style manual. I will confess this. It's like, that's not the last book you're ever going to need to have on your desk. It's a great book, and you should have it. A few of them.
And were there things, Benjamin, that you learnt writing the book? I mean, I guess language is constantly changing, and words come and go, and trends in language change, pronouns change. Were there any things that you really learnt in the process of writing it? Because it must have taken how long did it take to write the book?
6 years from the day I signed the contract till the day the book went on sale. That was a long time. I very foolishly, it was like, it was time to I mean, it's like I work in publishing, okay? I'm a managing editor. I know how these things go. Here, sign a contract. When are you turning in the manuscript? 12 months from now? What were they thinking? What were they thinking? Although, as they said to me, years later, well, we knew that if we gave you 1 year, we could have the manuscript in 4. If we gave you 4 years, we'd still be waiting for it. So they were smart. Anyway, and it got done eventually. But I did learn while I was working on the book. I really did learn that many of the things that I was so stiff about as a copy editor, the more I investigated things, the more I reinvestigated things, the more I realized and kept reminding myself language is a living thing, and it evolves and it changes, the more I realized that there are all these sort of shades of gray, and the happier I was embracing them. And I think it makes the book better. And if I may, I think it made a better person out of me. The one specific example, so not just to talk in abstractions. The one thing that I knew that I was going to have to write about, and I was dreading it, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I thought, you're just going to have to deal with this. You can't pretend this is not a thing. I was going to have to deal with the singular they. And my original idea was that I was going to write the book the way that I write, there was never going to be the use of the pronoun he to refer to just some sort of person. But like the he's were going to be attached to he's, the she's were going to be attached to she's, they's were going to be attached to they. And at the end of the book, I was going to say, oh, did you see what I haven't actually done for the previous 256 pages? I have never written one sentence that is anything like, a student should be able to study whatever he wants. Because that's a way of writing, that notion that you can use he as a, not as a default pronoun, to refer to a person whose gender is not particularly important in the context of the sentence, because, and this was the mindset, and this is the way when you read your way through the 20th century, it's like, well, of course, I mean, he, that's a perfectly good pronoun, because a default human being is a he. It's like, because that's a normal thing to be, is a he. And it's like, it doesn't work, because it's not true. People are not he unless otherwise specified. And when I started copy editing in the 1990s, it was the era of writers trying to figure out what to do about that. And it was this sort of long, difficult slog of writers writing he or she, sometimes she or he, a brief flirtation with S/HE, which is hideous, and all sorts of little things. But to jump, because the story can either go on for 30 minutes or I can try to wrap it up in 2. I mean, the thing about the singular they is it is part of the English language. It has been part of the English language for centuries, and though many of us have been trained not to use it and not to approve of it, it is language as she is spoke and as she is going to be writ. And you need to embrace that. You need to keep up with what people need language to do and what you need language to be. And I managed to do something which is very difficult for me. I managed to change my own mind about something, and to recognize that there are larger concerns than what I think is good copy editing. It's like there are human concerns, there are humane concerns. There's a bigger and more complicated world than the one I thought I was sitting in when I started my work in publishing 25, 30 years ago. And it's a wonderful thing to watch language evolve, and it's a really wonderful thing to participate in it and to help it along. And I've tried to do that, and I'll keep trying to do that.
Very eloquent answer. Thank you. Terrific. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.